where the moon lights.
An excellent day for an exorcism.
I'm your number one fan.
Hey up, and welcome back to another episode of Rate Scary. I am Scary Zara Mary. I am your host. And yes, I am flying solo again. I haven't got a guest with me this week, but that's okay because I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite ever films, which we're going to get into in a second. Now, if you're new to the podcast, right now we are digging into Gothic horror, spurred on mostly by the release of Nosferatu this year, but because I have an absolute love of the subgenre anyway. And so far I have covered The Woman in Black last week and also Nosferatu, so do go back and watch those, listen to them if you are interested. But this week we are covering another Robert Eggers film, which is The Witch. But before we get into that, I just wanted to cover off some recent horror news, as well as go into what it is that I have been watching recently. Now, I'm going to kick off first of all with some very, very sad news that we received this week, which is the passing of David Lynch, who unfortunately passed away at 78 years old. David Lynch was an absolute visionary when it came to directing. You'll know him for Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet. And it's a really, really sad loss generally, but also specifically for the horror community. And his family stated, there is a big hole in the world now that he is no longer with us. And I thought that iHorror News put it perfectly, because David once said, keep your eye on the donut and not on the hole. And I just thought that was a really lovely response to what is an absolute shame that we've lost him. In other news, it has been confirmed that Talk to Me, the prequel to Talk to Me, not confusing at all, from the Philippou brothers, will not release in 2025 as expected, which is a huge shame. But I don't think a surprise to anyone. And instead, the brothers are finishing a standalone film for A24 called Bring Her Back, which bizarrely sounds like it could be a sequel to Talk to Me, but apparently it isn't. For now, there's no information about Bring Her Back other than that the lead is Sally Hawkins, but hopefully we're going to hear something soon because filming has wrapped and it is now being edited. So hopefully we're going to get a release date. Hopefully we'll get a trailer. Hopefully we'll get some sort of information about this film, because I love Talk to Me and I need more of the Raka Raka films in my life. Speaking of trailers that have released this week, we have the trailer for The Woman in the Yard. This is yet another film from Blumhouse. They are, as per standard, churning them out this year. And I had a number of people message me after it dropped saying that they totally got vibes of The Woman in Black, especially after my episode last week, which I can totally see. I can absolutely see. I definitely get that vibe. It releases in March, so we haven't got long, just a couple of months until that releases. And it comes from director Jaume Collet-Serra, who did Orphan, did The Shallows, so two fantastic films, and also the recent Netflix thriller, which I haven't watched, but loads of people raved about, called Carry On. So just the director alone sounds promising, but I am just a little bit nervous, not just because it's Blumhouse, but based on the trailer alone, and also knowing Blumhouse's track record, I am getting vibes of yet another allegory for grief or generational trauma. It's an absolute staple from Bloom at this point, and can often be a little bit of a snore fest. So we will see. I am keeping my hopes up. I will obviously go and see it, but I'm dubious is what I'm going to say about that film. In other good news, finally, the dodgy CGI has been rectified in Alien Romulus for home and physical release. Thank God, hallelujah. Spoiler incoming if you haven't yet seen Romulus, but the main beef that people had with the film was that some of the CGI was just a little bit uncanny valley, especially on Rook, which was meant to pay homage to Ian Holm and meant to be this lovely thing, but unfortunately just ended up giving people, myself included, the creeps. So thankfully, director Fede Alvarez has confirmed that they have fixed the effect for the physical release of the film, meaning Romulus will give you the creeps, but in all the right ways. So that's my little roundup of stuff that is going on in horror over the last week. Now on to what I've watched. So I'm going to be really, really honest, because I think sometimes people see the persona online of Scary Zara Mary, or they see the podcast Rate Scary. And it's really, really easy, I think, with people that we follow online to forget that there is a person there. And I would hope that I could change that a little bit. And I do speak very openly about my mental health. I have done previously, and I will continue to do so always. And my mental health for the last 2 weeks has been terrible, if I'm honest. I'm laughing about it now. It's still not great. But it has been shocking, which has meant that I've taken a little bit of a step back from posting on socials and perhaps doing as much as I normally would. I've kept recording the podcast because it's something that I can sort of switch my brain off to and don't have to think about an awful lot. So it's been more of a joy and helped my mental health more than anything. And I think speaking to other people and other creators as well, what we found is January comes and it is like a race to get content out. Like everyone wants this year to be their best year ever. Everyone wants to do better than they did last year. And I include myself in that. I kicked off 2025 with that mindset. I had a shed load of content ready to go. I had a recording program. I had a content plan. And that all went to poop. Just because like I struggle with anxiety and depression anyway, which is an ongoing thing. And I manage it really, really well. I've had some stuff go on in my personal life recently, which I won't get into, but that kind of piled on top of my already poor mental health. And then just, I don't know, this kind of feeling of comparing yourself to others, almost competitive, like trying to get ahead of others. It's absolute rubbish, like, is what I've realised. And I think taking a step back has done me a world of good. And the reason why I mention this is because when my mental health isn't great, I don't have the energy to focus on new films because I feel like that takes quite a lot of mental, emotional investment. You've really got to be switched onto it, especially if you're going to be talking about it in a review. You've got to know what it is that you're talking about. So I have spent a lot of time revisiting some old favourites. And I have also spent a lot of time reading, which I haven't done for forever. I literally read one book last weekend. I did it in the space of 4 hours. I've gotten into Splatterpunk and Aaron Beauregard, if anyone has ever read those books. And after absolutely smashing one book in the space of a few hours, I then immediately went to a charity shop, bought another 4, and ordered another 4 online. So I think I'm now a book girly, a reading girly. I don't think I'll be posting book reviews on here just yet, but I will pop some details over on my Instagram. But I have also been introducing my husband, who isn't a huge horror fan, to some beloved horrors. We have an ongoing list of films that he hasn't seen before, that I would consider classics or have influenced the genre in some way, shape or form. And a couple of months ago, I got him to watch Final Destination. So this week we watched both Final Destination 2 and 3 back to back, because they are 2 of my favourites out of the entire franchise. And it was a joy to go back and watch them. Like they are so much fun. I think the opening scene of 2 is probably my favourite catastrophe out of all of those films. Everyone knows the log truck. Every millennial who has seen that film will swerve a log truck when they see it on the motorway. The special effects in 2 are looking a little bit worse for wear on rewatch. But I think 3 is my favourite overall, the one with the roller coaster. I think it has the best deaths. I think the special effects are way better. I think the storyline is pretty clear. And overall I've just got a real love for 3, and it has firmly put me off ever going on a sunbed. Not that I wanted to in the first place, but I definitely don't after Final Destination 3. And speaking of which, like my favourite deaths probably in the entire Final Destination franchise are from 2 and 3. So a couple of the ones from 2 are the ladder. I'm not going to go into detail on these just in case people haven't seen these films, but the ladder is fantastic. And the airbag in the car after the crash, amazing. So clever. Everyone talks about the sunbeds in 3, but for me, Frankie's death with the motor when he's in the queue for the drive-through, I think that is far better, as is the nail gun in the DIY hardware store. Both of those are just perfection. But like I said, Final Destination films, that has been a joy to go back and rewatch them. I'm looking forward to rewatching 4 and 5, and that'll line up just nicely with the release of Bloodlines later this year. I feel like if you haven't watched the Final Destination films, even if you're not big on horror, they're still pretty easy to watch. Like, they definitely have some really grim deaths, sure, but they're fun deaths, I think would be a good way to describe them. Like, they're creative, they're inventive. Sometimes you really don't see them coming. I expect at some point I'm probably going to do a deep dive on Final Destination films, but I need to figure out exactly which subgenre they fit into. Like, are they supernatural, or are they technically kind of a slasher? I don't know. So let me know in the comments so I can figure out which subgenre to put them in, so then I can do a deep dive on them. I also watched The Northman, so Robert Eggers is getting an awful lot of airtime on my podcast, given I've done an episode on Nosferatu. This episode is about The Witch, and I've watched The Northman this week, so clearly I need to wrap things up and watch The Lighthouse as well. But I thought I had seen The Northman before, but I think I might have fallen asleep the first time, because I remembered a couple of tiny little things, but the rest of it, absolutely nothing. And I had an absolute blast with it. Like, Eggers has got serious talent. It is visually exceptional, fantastic acting and tension, brilliant fight scenes, and some real gore in there. I'm a Game of Thrones girly. My husband is mega into Vikings, so this scratched an itch for both of us, and I would absolutely watch this again. I feel like you really do have to be switched on and locked in to watch The Northman, because it's quite intense. But yeah, I loved that, so I'm probably going to do a rewatch pretty soon, to be fair. And then the other film that I watched this week that is worth mentioning is actually a new film, and that is The Wolfman. Yeah, brand new release, directed by Lee Whannell, who also directed 2020's The Invisible Man. And I thought it was good. Like, it didn't blow my socks off, no. But I had a great time with it, absolutely. I think considering this is a Blumhouse picture, and I make it very clear how I have felt about previous Blumhouse pictures, I thought this was decent. I think they used some really interesting concepts. I thought there was a good level of tension. There's definitely some things that I would change about it. I'm probably going to do a bonus episode this week, actually, on The Wolfman, because I don't think it quite fits into Gothic Horror, but I do want to cover off some new releases. So expect bonus episodes for new releases along the way, and I'm going to record that this week. I'm also actually going to record a bonus episode this week for my first ever Patreon only episode. I'm going to be covering the ABCs of Death, which is one of my favourite ever anthology films. And it was suggested by one of my Patreon members, and I think it's such a great shout. So if you are interested in joining my Patreon, where you can access additional content, the links will be in the copy for this episode. So please do come along, join in the conversation, and you can suggest films for me to cover. So yeah, they are all the films that I watched this week. I already have some cinema trips lined up. We've got a couple of good releases coming up. Well, I'm hoping they're going to be good releases. I'm at the cinema on Sunday with Rose to go and see Presence, which I am very excited about. A ghost story from the perspective of a ghost. I've heard very, very good things. And then the following day on the Monday, me and Rose are back at the cinema. So this does also mean Tuppy Tours will be making a comeback. If you don't know what Tuppy Tours is and you are new to this, myself and my buddy Rose, when we go to the cinema, we have a Tupperware each and we pack it full of treats. And we basically give each other scores. So a rating out of 10 for the snacks that we've brought, and we call it Tuppy Tours. A lot of people seem to be in it. It's something that I have been recognised for, which I didn't think Tuppy Tours was going to be the thing that I'm known for, but you know what? I will take it. So Tuppy Tours is making a comeback finally. But yeah, we are also back at the cinema on Monday to go and see Odeon's Scream Unseen, which is where you book to go see a film, but you don't know what the film is until you are sat in the theatre and it starts playing. And they give out clues. So they give out 3 clues in the run up to the release. And I think it might be Companion just based on when it is releasing. But I'm also very curious to see that. So exciting times. Right, so now let's get into this week's episode. Like I said, I am covering another Robert Eggers film. This is one of my favourites of Robert Eggers, and it is The Witch, which released in 2015. So it turns 10 years old on the 23rd of January, actually, so only in a few days' time. So happy birthday, The Witch. And Robert Eggers was only 30 when he directed this, which I think is absolutely bonkers because I think it's a masterpiece. And I will say, if you haven't seen The Witch, I am going to be going into this in depth. So spoilers ahead. If you don't want to know the story, if you don't want to know the details, save this episode for later. Come back once you've watched it and then we can discuss in the comments. So I repeat, major spoilers ahead. Now I'm going to cover off first of all the story, and then we'll go a little bit into look and feel and the score and the cast and crew. So let's kick things off with what this film is actually about. The Witch is set in 1630s New England, and we have English settler William and his family, which includes his wife Catherine, his teenage daughter Thomasin, his preteen son Caleb, and his very young twins Mercy and Jonas, who are very annoying but also very sweet. And they have been banished from a Puritan settlement over a religious dispute. So they decide to build a farm near a large secluded forest, and Catherine bears her 5th child, Samuel. And while under Thomasin's care one day, Samuel disappears.
Boo!
And it's revealed that a witch has stolen and killed Samuel to use his body to make a flying ointment. Now, Catherine is obviously absolutely devastated by this loss, and she spends her days praying and crying regarding this incident. William takes Caleb hunting and walking in the woods, where Caleb wonders if Samuel, because he's unbaptized, went to heaven, and in response William discloses that he secretly traded Catherine's prized silver cup for hunting supplies. Back at the farm, the twins are playing with the family's big billy goat, Black Philip, who the children say talk to them.
Black Philip, progress out his head. Black Philip, to Nanny Queen is wed.
Very strange. Catherine blames Thomasin for misplacing her silver cup and then holds her responsible for the loss of Samuel. So poor Thomasin, she's getting the brunt of all of this grief and loss that Catherine is experiencing. And later that night, the children overhear their parents arguing about possible starvation and making plans to send Thomasin away to serve another family and also therefore to make some sort of money. The next morning, Thomasin and Caleb sneak into the forest to check a trap, and their dog chases a hare. With Caleb in pursuit, The hare frightens their horse, which throws Thomasin to the ground and knocks her completely unconscious. Caleb then becomes lost and discovers the dog's disemboweled body. Delving further into the woods, he then discovers a hovel from which a witch, disguised as a seductive young woman, emerges and kisses him. Thomasin wakes up and finds her way home by following her father William's voice. And as Catherine berates Thomasin for taking Caleb into the woods, William defends Thomasin by reluctantly admitting that he sold the cup. That night, Caleb returns to the farm, naked, delirious, he's very poorly, and Catherine suggests that Caleb's fallen victim to witchcraft and she prays for him. The next day, he experiences some very violent convulsions. He vomits an entire apple before passionately proclaiming his love for Christ and then dies peacefully. The two little twins, the little kids, accuse Thomasin of being a witch, but she then in turn accuses the two of them for having these conversations with Black Philip the goat, and then confronts the dad William on his intentions to send her away. And completely angered by the behaviour of his children, he locks them in the goat house. In the middle of the night, the twins and Thomasin awake to find the witch appearing as a naked old woman and drinking the blood of a goat. She turns towards them and laughs before attacking the twins off screen as Thomasin watches in pure terror. And in the house, Catherine is having some sort of a vision, a hallucination in which Caleb and Samuel have returned. And she takes Samuel and nurses him, but in reality, she has exposed her breasts to a raven, which proceeds to then peck at her body. In the morning, William finds the goat stable completely destroyed. The goats have been gone at. The twins are missing. And Thomasin is unconscious with bloody hands. And as she wakes up, Black Philip gores and kills William. Catherine is completely unhinged and blames Thomasin for everything that has happened up to this point and tries to strangle her, forcing Thomasin to kill her mother in self-defense. Now alone, Thomasin enters the goat house and urges Black Philip to speak to her.
Black Philip, I conjure thee to speak to me.
The goat responds in a human voice with one of the best quotes in the film, if you ask me. Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? So much so that I have that quote tattooed on my leg with a picture of Black Philip.
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter, a pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
And when he responds, he offers her the life that she desires. And when she accepts, he materializes into a very handsome, very darkly dressed man. And he tells her to remove her clothes and sign her name in a book. She's then accompanied by him in his goat form to enter the forest nude, where she finds a coven holding a witch's sabbath around a bonfire, and the witches begin to levitate. So Thomas joins them, laughing hysterically as she ascends above the trees, and that is where the film ends. What an incredible story. Like, there are so many reasons why this is one of my favourite Eggers films, if not one of my favourite ever horror films. Robert Eggers does a fantastic job of creating films that are based in folklore, mythology, often period pieces, and they are reflected through atmosphere, settings and environment. So I thought it would be fun to kind of get into some of the themes and then the look and feel of The Witch. So if we start off first of all with the themes that we see in the film, this is one of those films that I think people will probably describe as elevated horror, because the film's impact is not delivered through your typical scares like jump scares or blood and gore, but it is through the effect of ambience and tension and dread. And this is typical of Eggers. You see this in all of his films, but then you also throw into there expressionist lighting, different kinds of camera use, the soundtrack that's in there, and you get an even further heightened sense of tension, which I think is typical of Gothic horror as well. And then also we have some typically Gothic themes used throughout, and I'm going to talk about them, and then we'll talk about a film which I think mirrors this. So The Witch orbits around psychological conflict. We've got this repressive, patriarchal portrayal of this Puritan society that the family belonged to. But then we also have this dark liberation of witches. We have this main female character, Thomasin, and she harbours these desires, this want for independence. She wants to differ from those of her conventionally Christian family, and she completely yearns for independence, sexuality, acceptance, and probably a little bit of power as well, given she doesn't really have any in that family setting. But then you have her father and her Christian God that she is supposed to worship failing to fulfill those needs. So Satan speaks personally and directly to her, offering satisfaction. And with the complete demise of her family and the rejection of this Puritan society, Thomasin is able to join Satan and the witches in order to fulfill this longing that she has had. And that last scene where she's completely nude and walking into the witches' coven and joining them and levitating reflects her act of casting away the bonds of her previous society. And I don't know about you, but this all sounds very familiar to Nosferatu. Now, Robert Eggers, when he released this film, openly said 10 years ago that he would love to do a version of Nosferatu, and here we are in 2025 with it having been released a couple of weeks ago. But I feel like if he wasn't able to release Nosferatu 10 years ago, then this is almost hinting at his want and desire to cover that story. You know, you've got this woman who yearns and craves for independence, but lives in a society where that is not possible, and the men around her do not enable that or even allow it, and reaches out to an entity that is willing to give her all of those things. And unfortunately, that entity isn't the nicest entity. In Nosferatu, we have Count Orlok. In The Witch, we have Black Phillip. So I just thought that was convenient thematically that we've got kind of two parallels there. I also think it's quite interesting that we've got these polarizing religions within the film as well. So you have this Puritan society, you have this setting of this Puritan home on the edge of society, which Thomasin doesn't wish to be a part of. She rejects it completely, and then instead turns to a different kind of religion on the complete other end of the scale. Satan's temptation of Thomasin has traits of grooming, you know, slowly alienating her from her family. And despite her being ecstatic at joining the coven, she has not escaped religion entirely. She has just changed direction, turning to murder in exchange for freedom. So it's not a totally happy ending in this film, certainly not for Thomasin, although it may seem like it on paper. I think the other thing that is great thematically about this film, which we often see in Gothic horror, is the setting. So this isn't set in some grand castle, but it is set right on the edge of a forest. We have this conflict kind of symbolically between civilization and also nature, which is present throughout the film. You've got this family living next to a dark forest, a place that is tied to witchcraft in their culture. And the forest, as well as the nudity that we see in this film, could be associated with monstrosity and untamed wilderness. forbidden liberation, sexuality. And we see this as well when Caleb returns from the woods after meeting with the witch too. Speaking of setting, Robert Eggers, we talked about it on the Nosferatu episode, but he loves to build an entire world when he is creating his films. And we see that again in The Witch. He does a lot of research when it comes to his films. And for this one, he worked very, very closely and thoroughly with both British and American museums. He consulted with experts on 17th century British agriculture, because he wants his sets to be as historically accurate as possible. He even brought in a thatcher and a carpenter from America, from Virginia and Massachusetts, who had the actual experience of building in the style of the film's period. He really wanted to film on location in New England, but he chose to film in Canada due to some little tax incentives that were there for him. You know, he was very early on in his career, I can't blame him. But it proved to be a bit of a problem for him because he couldn't find the forest environment that he really wanted. So he just started scouting the map and found a place in Ontario that was completely remote. And he said that the nearest town made New Hampshire look like a metropolis. And he also did the casting in England because Eggers wanted authentic accents to represent a family that had just arrived in colonial Plymouth. So he is very, very particular. He pays a lot of attention to detail. And I think we see that beautifully in The Witch. The way that the film looks as well, I think stylistically, it's very on point for Eggers. Very grim, very bleak, also very on point for Gothic Horror. Again, it's kind of got this grey blue tone to the film. Reportedly, he wanted so much of an authentic look that he only shot with natural light. And indoors, the only lighting that he wanted to use was candles. So again, something that we see in Nosferatu. And even in the way that the film was released, everyone calls this film the VVITCH because the title is spelt with two V's instead of a W, because in that period, W wasn't used. So even just that attention to detail, I think, is fantastic. And then we've got what I think is a fantastic score. We've got music that is written by Mark Corvin. And his aim for the music was that he wanted it to be tense and dissonant while also focusing on minimalism. And Eggers had vetoed the use of any electronic instruments for this film because they wouldn't have been around at the time, so it wouldn't have been relevant. But he also didn't want any traditional harmony or melody in the score. Like, nothing like setting someone a challenge, is there? So Corvin decided to create music with instruments that you typically would not see or use in a film, which included a nickel harper and a waterphone, which, like, I had no idea what those two instruments were until I googled them, but I can totally see why he used them because it does create this very creepy, atmospheric sense of dread, lingering noises throughout the film, very folklorish, almost mystical in parts. And because Mark Corvin knew Robert Eggers quite well, he relied quite heavily on improv so that then Eggers could move notes around wherever he wanted and get it to a score that Eggers was happy with. Like, Robert Eggers is obsessed with detail. He is an absolute perfectionist. I don't know how good he is to work with on set. Like, I feel like the things I hear about him would suggest that he's a nightmare based on how much creative control he has over his films. But I haven't heard that at the same time. And when you look at what he presents on screen, I kind of don't blame him for being a perfectionist because he delivers 4 for 4, in my opinion. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of The Lighthouse, they're all stunning films. And then I do also want to talk about the cast. A cast of people that we have seen crop up a couple of other times actually in Robert Eggers films. So first of all, you've got Anya Taylor-Joy, who plays Thomasin. She must have been so young in this film. She looks like she must have been just 20, if that. But she looks so sweet and so innocent, but also perfectly captures this young woman who has her own thoughts, feelings, desires, impulses, and wants to regain a little bit of control of that. And who can blame her? That's what I want every single day, and I have way more independence than she could ever have at that time. And then obviously Eggers used her again in The Northman, which I thought she was fantastic in. I preferred her in The Witch, personally. She was also rumoured to have been at the top of the list for casting when it came to Nosferatu, but again, I'm glad that Eggers decided not to use her and went with Lily Rose Depp instead. As brilliant as Anya is, I think that was a correct casting choice. We then have Kate Dickie in the role of Catherine. I find this woman so incredibly creepy, but I think that's because, like I said at the beginning of the episode, I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan. I find her insanely creepy in Game of Thrones and unnerving, and I get that same vibe from her in The Witch. And I just think she does a fantastic job of portraying this completely overbearing mother who also clearly has a lot of love for her family. She cares deeply about her children, about her husband, but she at the same time is not a likable woman, and I do a little internal cheer when Thomasin goes for her right at the end. And then the last person that I wanted to talk about in the cast, like there are so many other people in the cast who I think are fantastic, like Harvey Scrimshaw, who plays Caleb, and then you've also got the kids who play Mercy and Jonas. They're amazing, but I did want to finish by talking about Ralph Ineson, who I absolutely love. This is probably my favourite feature of him in an Eggers film, despite him appearing in others. I just love him in this. I'm obsessed with the way that this man looks, the way that this man sounds. I just think he is a perfect fit for period pieces, and I can totally understand why Eggers keeps bringing him back. And I don't think it'll be the last we see of him in an Eggers film either. I tell you what they need to do. They need to release an audiobook of The Witch, and Ralph Ineson can just read all of the parts and I will listen to it because I love his voice so much. Supposedly as well, he is going to be in Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. He's playing a professor of some sort, so at least we get to see him on our screens again this year. Well, at least for me. I don't know if you're bothered, but I'm super excited to see him in another film. And I love to see what he does next. So in summary, The Witch, a fantastic Gothic period piece. This atmosphere that is created on this little edge of civilization next to this forest. Perfect Gothic setting. Then you throw in, again, use of pathetic fallacy. We see in Robert Eggers films, he loves to use the weather to reflect mood of certain scenes. Very typical of Gothic horror again. The story itself, we have elements of religion and sexuality and independence and a little bit of feminism. All themes that we see throughout Gothic horror. And then, of course, it is called The Witch. We have witches. We love to see it. I don't think we see witches as much in Gothic horror. It tends to lean more towards ghosts and vampires and monsters. But I feel like this does a great job of portraying a witch creepily, beautifully. It's set just before the Salem witch trials. Again, because it's a period piece, it's something that we can recognise and almost relate to. Witches have themes of being outcast from societies, which again we often see in Gothic horror. So for that reason, I love The Witch. I think it is a perfect Gothic horror film. I hope you have enjoyed my little recap and ramble of The Witch. I'm excited to watch it again, actually. I did a rewatch in preparation for this episode, but this always happens when I record a podcast episode talking about the film. I just want to go back and rewatch it again because I'm like, oh, I need to pick up on that, or oh, I need to delve into that a little bit further. I never get enough with these films. But I think it'll probably have to go to the back of the queue because I have some time set aside this week to record some additional episodes, so upcoming episodes for the podcast. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to do a bonus episode on The Wolfman, which will release later this week. I am also doing my Patreon episode, which is the ABCs of Death. But I am also recording 2 upcoming episodes this week. First one being with Sam from Horror, Halloween and Home. We are recording an episode on Crimson Peak because this is the Gothic horror film that the most people mentioned, and Sam is obsessed with this film, so I cannot wait to talk to her about it. And then I am also recording an episode this week with Rose. She's coming back to the show and we are going to talk about Sleepy Hollow. So I'm really glad that I'm getting some company back because I don't think I could do every single episode just talking to myself. It would be nice to have a conversation with someone else. But if you have enjoyed this episode, I do hope you would stick around. Take a watch or listen of my previous episodes if you want to catch up on this subgenre. If you are watching on YouTube, I'd love it if you could like and subscribe. I am still building on here. I'm still very much a newbie. And if you are listening on your podcast player, please do drop a follow and hit a rating. It helps with the algorithm, getting it out to more people. It helps me massively, and it gives me a nice little ego boost as well. And you can also find me on various different social media sites. So you can find me on Instagram and YouTube as @RateScary. And I am also on Instagram as @ScaryZaraMary, as well as TikTok, Blue Sky and Threads. But that is it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for sticking around and doing this little deep dive with me. I cannot wait to get into more horror with you. See you with this then. I'll see you soon.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
I'll be right back.
Game over.
It's all for you.
Beware the moonlights.
An excellent day for an exorcism.
I'm your #1 fan.